The Duke of Loxmere gave his bride a dead orchard for a wedding gift. He placed its deed beside her breakfast plate before 80 guests and told her, with a smile too cold to be mistaken, that at least she could do no harm to trees already ruined. 6 months later, carts were carrying food from that same ground into every parish in Mereford, while the man who had starved it stood in irons at the gate. This is a story of a marriage made from debt, a quiet insult planted in winter, and a woman who answered cruelty with a harvest. The wax candles in Briarwick Hall smelled of honey, but the February rain had soaked so many wool coats that the wedding breakfast carried the odour of a crowded stable. Water ticked against the tall windows, silver dishes cooled beneath painted ceilings. At the centre of it all sat Cecily Fenwick, newly made Duchess of Loxmere, with rain still darkening the hem of her ivory gown. She had been married for 43 minutes. Her husband had spoken to her for fewer than 10 of them. Nathaniel Grantham, 8th Duke of Loxmere, stood at the head of the table, with one hand resting beside an unopened bottle of champagne. He was 32, broad-shouldered, precisely dressed, and possessed of the sort of stillness that made other men lower their voices. His black hair was damp at the temples from the churchyard rain. Nothing in his face suggested that he had just promised before God to honour the woman beside him. "Before we drink," he said, "I have a gift for her grace." Conversation softened at once. The Dowager Countess nearest Cecily raised her lorgnette. Lady Lavinia Sedgwick, Nathaniel's aunt, gave a small, expectant laugh. 2 footmen carried forward a narrow walnut box, old enough for its brass corners to have gone green. Cecily looked at her husband. "You told me there would be no gifts." "I find that marriage alters arrangements before the ink is dry." He opened the box. Inside lay a folded conveyance tied with grey ribbon, a ring of iron keys, and 1 blackened apple twig. The guests nearest them leaned closer. 312 acres on the western edge of Briarwick, Nathaniel said. The cinder orchard, its walls, sheds, spring house, and all produce a rising from the land. Settled in trust for my wife's separate use, exactly as Lady Fenwick required. Cecily's mother went rigid 3 seats away. Lady Lavinia's smile sharpened. "The cinder orchard? Nathaniel, how very generous." Someone farther down the table smothered a laugh. Cecily picked up the twig. Its bark stained her glove with soot-coloured dust, yet it was not fire that had blackened it. The wood had been cankered, cut badly, then left on wet ground. "How long has it stood empty?" she asked. Mr. Gideon Rusk, the estate steward, answered before the Duke could. Rusk was a narrow man of 50 with careful whiskers and clean white cuffs. 5 years without a marketable crop, Your Grace. 3 gardeners declared the soil exhausted. The last was dismissed at Michaelmas. And the trees? Dead, Nathaniel said. Every useful one. The laughter came openly then, not loud enough to be called discourteous, but bright enough to travel the full length of the table. Cecily laid the twig across the deed. "Why give it to me?" His gaze held hers. Their marriage had been negotiated through solicitors because the late Sir Aldous Fenwick had lent Nathaniel's father £30,000. The old Duke had died before repaying a shilling. Cecily had inherited the bond. Nathaniel had inherited the debt, 12 villages, a great house, and a fury at being made to feel like an item in a creditor's book. If he sold 3 tenant farms, he could have paid her. If she pressed the bond, 300 families would lose their leases. Instead, she had agreed to fold the debt into a marriage settlement. Briarwick would remain whole. Her mother would retain Fenwick Lodge. Nathaniel would gain time. He believed she had purchased a coronet. She had never told him that she agreed because she knew the names of the families his pride would have displaced. "You required land of your own," he said. "Now you have more than most women in England, land without life. A fitting occupation for a lady who believes every neglected thing can be rescued. The room stopped breathing. Nathaniel lifted his glass. To the Duchess and her orchard. Cecily did not touch the champagne. Across the table, her mother's fingers closed around a napkin. Lady Lavinia looked delighted. Rusk stared down at his cuffs, but not before Cecily saw the satisfaction in his mouth. She rose. Rain pressed silver fingers against the windows behind her. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "I shall remember precisely what you thought you were giving me." She left the black twig on his white tablecloth. Nathaniel departed for London the next morning. He said Parliament required him, although Parliament would not sit for 9 days. His travelling carriage rolled from Briarwick before dawn, leaving 2 black grooves in the mud and no message for his wife. Cecily watched from her bedchamber until the lamps vanished. At breakfast, the housekeeper brought her a ring of orchard keys and an apology she had not been asked to give. Mrs. Hester Pell, the woman introduced herself. She was square, silver-haired, and dressed in black bombazine, polished at the elbows. "I have kept this house since His Grace was in leading strings. The western road is poor after rain. You ought to take the small gig. Will the steward object?" Mr. Rusk objects to weather when he has not ordered it. It was the first honest sentence Cecily had heard at Briarwick. The western road crossed 2 miles of bare park before dropping into a valley enclosed by a red brick wall. The wall was 12 feet high in places and split by frost. Brambles strangled the southern gate. Beyond it, rows of apple and pear trees stood in the wet grass, like hundreds of bent old men. No birds moved among them. The silence disturbed her more than the ruin. Cecily left the gig and pushed through the gate. Her boots sank to the ankle. Pruned branches lay rotting where they had fallen years before. The packing shed had lost half its roof. Along the eastern wall, 6 arched recesses faced the weak morning sun. Bee bowls once built to shelter straw skeps, but everyone was empty. She walked to the nearest apple tree and pressed her thumb to a low branch. Brittle, the next was hollow. The third bore black lesions where a careless blade had spread disease from limb to limb. At the 7th tree, she drew a small pruning knife from her reticule. "You'll find no fruit there." The voice belonged to a boy crouched behind the wall. He could not have been more than 10. His cap was too large. His knees showed through his breeches, and he held half a turnip with teeth marks around its raw edge. "What is your name?" Cecily asked. "Jem Briar. Does your family live here?" Grandfather did, before Mr. Rusk put him off. The dismissed gardener. Cecily looked at the turnip. "Is that your breakfast?" Jem wiped it against his sleeve, ashamed of being seen hungry. "Ma'am cuts the bread thin on Thursdays, thin enough to see Sunday through it." The words entered her more cleanly than a knife. She turned back to the tree, pared away a patch of bark no wider than a fingernail, and found a wet green line beneath the grey. "Fetch your grandfather," she said. The boy glanced at the dead rose. "Why?" Cecily closed the knife. "Because the orchard is not dead." By noon, Thomasbres stood before her beneath the ruined packing shed. He was 68, stooped on one side, and missing the tip of his left forefinger. He removed his hat when Cecily entered, but his pale eyes held no faith in Duchess's. "The top growth is dying," she said. "Some trunks are hollow, but the rootstocks along the lower rows are alive." Mr. Rusk said. 3 gardeners declared the soil exhausted. Mr. Rusk paid 2 men to say it. The third was me, and I said no such. Rain drummed through the broken roof. Thomas led her to the northern boundary, where a stone channel emerged from the hill. It should have carried spring water into a holding pond at the orchard's centre. Instead, its bed was dry and packed with moss. Beyond the wall, she could hear water running strongly downhill toward the Duke's ornamental lake. The old Duke had the western spring divided, Thomas said. One course for the villages, one for the orchard, one for the house lake. Rusk had a new weir built after His Grace's father took ill. The lake gets all 3 shares now. Why would the steward destroy 300 acres of productive land? Thomas looked toward the empty bee bowls. A dead orchard needs no labor. Hungry tenants take whatever terms they're offered, and a steward who buys the estate's grain through his brother's factor can make a fine living from scarcity. Cecily heard the accusation, but she also heard what was missing. Proof. Can these trees bear this year? Some may, if the water returns. Not enough. Then we shall not ask the trees to do everything. She stepped into the rain and looked down the broad lanes between the rows. The old orchard had been planted for wagons and ladders, leaving strips of open soil, wide enough to plough. 312 acres of insult. 312 acres of possibility. How many sound acres between the trunks? Thomas narrowed his eyes. Near 200, if you count the north slope. Potatoes on the lighter ground, field beans and peas where the soil holds moisture. Turnips after the earliest crop, cabbages along the south wall. Seed costs money. My settlement allows me £80 each quarter for the orchard's improvement. Labour costs more. Then we begin with those who need wages most. He studied her kid gloves, now streaked with green bark and mud. His Grace will stop you. His Grace gave me the land before 80 witnesses. Thomas's mouth moved at one corner. Aye, he said, that he did. Mr. Rusk arrived before sunset, carrying the orchard account book beneath his coat. He found Cecily in the servants' hall with Mrs. Pell, listing every tenant widow, underemployed labourer, and former gardener within 4 miles. Your Grace, he said, I must protest. You may do so from the chair. Mrs. Pell has just brought tea. He remained standing. The spring is estate property. The teams are required for spring ploughing. Any expenditure must pass through my office. Cecily opened her marriage settlement to the ribboned page. The orchard, its buildings, waters, ways, easements, and produce are held for my separate use. The trustees approved £80 for immediate improvement. Rusk did not look at the wording. He had known it already. £80 will disappear into that ground. Then you will be relieved to learn that I shall account for every penny, and when it fails. She dipped her pen. You may laugh at the next wedding breakfast. For the first 3 weeks, the cinder orchard produced nothing but blistered hands. Cecily hired 27 women, 11 older boys, and 8 men, whom Rusk had dismissed from estate work. She paid the women 8p a day, the men a shilling, and every worker received a hot noon meal from Briarwick's kitchen. Lady Lavinia called it an assembly of beggars. Cecily called it a payroll. They burned diseased wood away from the living trees, scrubbed pruning blades with spirits between cuts, rebuilt drains, and lifted bramble roots from the soil. Thomas taught the boys to cut scions with 3 buds and bind them to healthy rootstock with waxed cloth. Cecily worked beside them until the soft skin beneath her wedding ring split. Each evening, she wrote the day's costs in a new book. Seed potatoes, £12 and 6 shillings. Bean seed, £4. 2 ploughshares repaired. Bread, onions and dripping for 46 workers. No sum was rounded. No name omitted. On the 21st day, they reached the blocked watercourse. The obstruction was not silt. Beneath the moss lay 2 courses of new brick packed with tarred wool. Someone had built a wall inside the old conduit and hidden it under stones. Thomas struck it once with a mattock, and clear water wept through the crack. Every worker fell silent. That was no accident, Mrs. Pell said. Cecily touched the wet brick. No, it was an instruction. They broke through at dusk. The spring entered the orchard with the force of something imprisoned. It raced along the stone channel, black at first with old leaves, then bright enough to catch the dying light. Children ran beside it. Women laughed. Thomas stood ankle-deep in the holding pond and covered his face with both hands. Within a week, the lower grass changed color. Within 2, buds swelled on branches Mr. Rusk had called dead. Nathaniel's first letter arrived in early March. It contained no greeting. "I am informed that you have hired estate tenants away from necessary fieldwork," it read. The orchard allowance was intended to preserve the property, not to finance a public spectacle. "You will submit future expenses to Mr. Rusk." Cecily read it twice, folded it, and wrote beneath the final line, "No tenant under an existing contract has been hired. 46 people without regular employment are now earning wages. The orchard is preserved by becoming useful. Mr. Sus may inspect my accounts whenever he wishes, provided he brings his own for comparison." She sent the same sheet back. His reply did not come. April arrived cold. Seed potatoes went into ridges between the pear rows. Beans followed in dark squares. Then peas beneath hazel supports cut from the boundary hedge. Along the southern wall, the women set cabbage plants beneath straw cloches. 4 new bee-skeps were placed in the old brick bowls, facing the morning sun. The work gave hunger a shape that could be fought. Jem's mother, Alice Breyer, became keeper of the food shed and could add columns faster than the steward's clerk. A cooper's widow named Ruth Packer organized the women into teams. Thomas stopped removing his cap every time Cecily crossed the field. By May, he merely touched the brim and told her when she was wrong. She was wrong often enough to trust him. They lost 1 row of early potatoes to frost. A grafting experiment failed along the east wall. Rabbits entered through a broken drain and ate 200 young pea shoots in a single night. Cecily did not answer failure with speeches. She ordered wire, replanted, and altered the accounts. Then the apple blossom opened. It began on 12 trees near the restored pond. White stars covered branches that had appeared lifeless at the wedding. The next morning, blossom showed on 37 more. By the end of the week, a pale cloud stretched across the lower orchard, humming with bees. People came from 3 villages to see it. Lady Lavinia came too, carrying a parasol, though the sky was overcast. "How picturesque," she said. "Peas beneath apple trees. One hopes you are not turning Briarwick into a market garden." "One hopes precisely that," Cecily replied. Mr. Rusk walked behind Lady Lavinia, tapping his cane against his boot. He inspected the pond, the planted ridges, and the shelves of labelled seed. His expression remained smooth until Alice Breyer handed Cecily the weekly account. 71 workers, he asked. "There are more applicants than places. Your allowance cannot support this." The early greens sold at Mereford Market. The proceeds returned to the wage fund. "Under whose authority did you sell, estate produce?" Cecily looked toward the gate, where the deed's wording had been painted on a new board for every worker to see. "Mine." Rusk's cane stopped tapping. That afternoon, Jem found a dead rook nailed to the packing shed door. A strip of paper had been tied around its leg. Widows should remember winter. Alice wanted the boy sent home. Thomas wanted to carry the bird directly to the magistrate. Cecily folded the message into her account book and ordered 2 men to watch the orchard at night. Fear, she had learned, became less obedient once it was entered in ink. 3 nights later, someone cut the straps on the north sluice. The damage was discovered before the pond emptied, yet the intention was plain. Cecily sent copies of both incidents to Nathaniel in London. She received a message from his secretary saying, "His Grace was occupied with a committee on grain prices and would return after the session's present business." Grain prices. She sat alone in the orchard office with the reply in one hand and Rusk's warning in the other. The irony was so clean that it hurt. "There is something you ought to see," Thomas said from the doorway. He carried a narrow tin dispatch box, rusted along the hinge. They had found it behind loose boards while repairing the former gardener's cottage. Inside were old pruning records, a water map drawn on linen, and a sealed letter addressed to Nathaniel's father. The seal bore the mark of Edwin Shaw, Briarwick's surveyor, dead for nearly 3 years. Across the front, in a different hand, someone had written, "To be held until his grace is well enough to act." The old Duke had never recovered. Cecily turned the letter toward the lamp. The seal remained intact. "Open it," Alice whispered. "It is not addressed to me." Thomas gave a bitter laugh. "The man it was meant for is in the family vault. Then it belongs to his heir." She placed the unopened letter inside her desk and locked it. Outside, the orchard bloomed beneath a moon too bright for secrecy. The next morning, the letter was gone. Only 4 people possessed keys to the office: Cecily, Alice, Thomas, and Mr. Rusk. Alice arrived first and turned white at the open drawer. Thomas searched the floor and windows. There was no broken latch, no footprint, no scrap of wax. "He knows we found it," Thomas said. Cecily looked through the doorway at the long green rose. "Then, whatever is inside frightens him more than the orchard does." At noon, a black travelling carriage appeared on the western road. The Duke had come home. Nathaniel entered the orchard on horseback with London dust on his coat and anger held tightly beneath his jaw. He had received Cecily's report of sabotage, her copies of the accounts, and a separate letter from Rusk claiming that the Duchess had exceeded her allowance by £300 and incited tenants to defy their leases. He expected confusion. Instead, he found straight ridges of green extending between flowering trees, a repaired watercourse flashing in the sun, and 71 workers who stopped only long enough to bow. The sight disturbed him more than ruin would have done. Cecily met him beside the pond. She wore a plain brown gown, an apron marked with soil, and no bonnet. Sun had darkened her face. The woman he had left beneath Briarwick's painted ceiling seemed to have stepped out of her own skin. "Your Grace," she said, "I was told the orchard was exhausted. It was thirsty." He dismounted and examined the water running under the bridge. "Rusk says you demolished an estate weir. We removed a wall built illegally inside the orchard conduit. The weir remains. He also says you have spent money not yet released by your trustees." "He lies." Nathaniel's head lifted. Cecily handed him the account book. "Every receipt is pinned at the back. The wages are signed or marked by each worker. Income from market sales is on the left. Expenditure is on the right. I have £17, 9 shillings, and 4p remaining." He turned pages with increasing care. His steward's quarterly books had never been so exact. "Why did you not send this to me?" "I sent copies twice. I received summaries from Rusk." "That is not the same thing." The words landed between them without ornament. Nathaniel looked beyond her to the people returning to work. "You should have waited for my permission before hiring my tenants. They were not employed by you. They receive parish relief when no work is available. Relief keeps a body alive. Wages allow a person to remain standing while it happens." His mouth hardened. "You speak as though I chose the failed harvest. I speak as though you chose not to look at it." Thomas's pruning saw stopped in the nearest tree. Nathaniel lowered his voice. "You are my wife, only when my obedience is required. In every other matter, I have been a creditor you married and abandoned." For one moment, the whole orchard seemed to wait. Then a bell rang from the spring house. Alice ran toward them, breathless, the waters falling. They reached the holding pond as its surface dropped below the first stone mark. Thomas opened the sluice fully. The incoming channel produced only a brown trickle. Nathaniel stared uphill. "The lake gate. Can Rusk close it?" Cecily asked. "He carries the estate keys." The Duke mounted without another word. Cecily caught his bridle. "If you confront him now, he will call it an error. Then what do you propose?" We find where the water has gone before he can hide it. They rowed together to the ornamental lake. The summer house stood empty. At the far bank, water poured through a newly cut channel toward Rusk's leased grazing land, flooding a meadow that needed none of it. The iron wheel controlling the orchard course had been chained shut. Nathaniel dismounted and touched the new lock. The metal still carried oil. "An error?" Cecily asked. He did not answer. They followed the channel to a small stone pump house. Inside were coils of rope, spare sluice straps, 3 bags of imported rye, bearing the mark of Bexley and Rusk grain factors, and a stack of receipts for grain, charged to Briarwick at nearly twice the Mereford market price. Nathaniel picked up the top receipt. His face changed without moving. The factor's address belonged to Gideon Rusk's brother. "How long?" Cecily asked. He checked the date. 4 years. 4 years of buying grain through an undisclosed family firm. 4 years of charging the estate for scarcity the steward himself had helped create. 4 years of keeping tenant wages low and parish dependence high, while money passed quietly from Briarwick into Rusk hands. On the rear wall hung a rusted key with grey sealing wax caught in its teeth. The key to Cecily's office. Hoofbeats struck the road outside. Rusk appeared in the doorway with 2 estate men behind him. "Your Grace," he said. "I can explain." Nathaniel held up the receipt. "Begin with this." Rusk looked at Cecily, not the Duke. "Her Grace has no understanding of estate trade. Bexley extends credit when other factors refuse. A premium is expected. A premium paid to your brother. A relation does not make a contract criminal. The hidden accounts, Smay." Rusk's composure thinned. "Briarwick survived because I made decisions your father lacked the strength to make. Tenants are obedient when hunger reminds them what they owe. Your wife will undo that discipline in a single summer." Cecily stepped toward the wall. "Where is the sealed letter?" His eyes betrayed him. It lasted less than a second, but Nathaniel saw. "Search him," the Duke ordered. The 2 estate men did not move. Rusk smiled. "They answer to the man who pays them." Nathaniel stood alone between his steward's servants and the wife he had mocked before 80 guests. Authority, he discovered, was a fragile thing when it had been lent too long to another man. Rusk backed into the doorway. "You may dismiss me, Your Grace. But before you do, ask how the quarter's interest will be paid. Ask who holds the forward contract on your wheat. Ask what happens when every creditor in London learns that the Duchess has spent your last ready money on cabbages." He turned and walked out. The estate men followed him. Nathaniel did not stop them. Cecily watched the carriage disappear. "He thinks you cannot act without destroying Briarwick. He may be right. Is that why you gave me the orchard?" The question stripped away every account and excuse. Nathaniel looked at the grey wax on the stolen key. "I gave it to you because I wanted you to feel what I felt when your solicitor placed my father's debt before me. Something large, humiliating, and impossible to escape. You might have tried honesty. I had been taught that honesty is what powerful men demand from people who cannot retaliate." And now his fingers closed around the receipt until the paper creased. "Now I find that I have not been powerful at all." Cecily took the chain from the sluice wheel. "Then begin by helping me turn this." The wheel required both of them. Rust tore Nathaniel's gloves. Cecily braced one foot against the stone. When the gate finally lifted, water struck the orchard channel below with a deep, living sound. They stood shoulder to shoulder, breathing hard. It was not forgiveness, but it was the first thing they had done together. Nathaniel dismissed Gideon Rusk before dinner. The former steward received the words without surprise. He placed the estate keys on the library desk one at a time, keeping the smallest until last. "The quarter's interest falls due at Michaelmas," Rusk said. £18,000, including the wheat advance. Bexley will not extend it after today. You arranged that advance without disclosing your interest in the firm. Your father signed the general security. My father could scarcely hold a spoon in his final year. Rusk set down the last key. His mark was witnessed. Nathaniel rose from behind the desk. By whom? Men whose memories improve when properly encouraged. Cecily stood near the window with Mrs. Pell. She saw the violence move through Nathaniel and disappear behind discipline. "Leave Briarwick," he said. "If you enter estate land again without lawful cause, I will have you removed." Rusk bowed to Cecily. "Your Grace has 6 weeks of green leaves and calls it victory. Autumn is less sentimental." After he had gone, Nathaniel opened the safe behind his father's portrait. The estate's ready money amounted to less than £2,000. Wheat stood thin in the eastern fields after wet spring and dry June. Rents were already late. The London house was mortgaged. So were 3 farms Nathaniel had once believed unencumbered. "How much could the tenant land bring?" Cecily asked. "Enough, if sold quickly." "No, you cannot command arithmetic. Neither can you call a solution anything that leaves 3 villages without homes." He closed the safe. "Your bond created this marriage because I would not sell those farms. My bond prevented the bank from taking them." Nathaniel turned. Cecily had not intended to tell him in anger. Yet the truth had waited too long upon his false idea of her. "Your solicitors offered payment in land," she said. "Fenwick Lodge would have gained the farms at Elm Cross, Weaver's End and Lower Heath. My mother and I refused. Why? Because your debt was not the tenant's debt. You could have remained at Fenwick Lodge with £30,000 in land, and watched your bailiffs put Alice Briar, Mrs. Pell's sister, and 200 other people on the road? Yes, I could have done that." Rain began against the library windows. Soft and persistent, Nathaniel looked at the woman he had accused of buying his name. "You married me to keep the estate whole. I married you because every other settlement made innocent people pay for the quarrel between our dead fathers. Why did you never say so? Would you have believed me at the wedding breakfast?" He had no answer. Cecily walked to the door. His voice stopped her. The orchard was not a gift. No, it was punishment. She faced him. For the first time since the church, Nathaniel looked at her without rank, resentment, or defense between them. "I am ashamed of it," he said. Cecily's hand remained on the door latch. "Shame is a private feeling, Your Grace. Repair is a public act." The next morning, Nathaniel came to the orchard without a groom. He gave Thomas authority over every estate team not required for the wheat fields. He ordered the lake divided according to the old water map. He sent an independent clerk to copy 4 years of accounts and a solicitor to trace Bexley's securities. Then he removed his coat, entered the bean field, and asked where he was useful. Thomas handed him a hoe. "Blisters first," the old gardener said. "Usefulness after." The Duke worked badly. He cut 2 bean stems, stepped on a potato ridge, and mistook a water chute for sound-fruiting wood. No one laughed until Cecily did. The sound surprised them both. Nathaniel looked up, a streak of soil across one cheek. "Your workers are insubordinate. They follow the example of their employer. I begin to understand Rusk's complaints. It was not peace, but for an hour it resembled it. July hardened the ground. The restored spring kept the orchard alive, yet the wheat beyond the walls paled before the ears had filled. Reports arrived from every side of Merriford. Flour had risen again. 2 mills had reduced their grinding. Parish officers purchased grain at prices that emptied their poor rate funds. In Hearth Village, a woman boiled nettles with a handful of oatmeal and called it supper for 5 children. Cecily expanded the second planting. Early potatoes were lifted from 20 acres and replaced with turnips. Pea vines were dried for fodder. Bean rows were weeded by lantern after sunset to save water during the day. Fruit that would never keep was sliced in the drying house or cooked into thick apple cheese. Nothing was treated as too small to count. Nathaniel carried the orchard figures to a meeting of Mereford landowners. He returned with his cravat loosened and fury in his eyes. They called it feminine enthusiasm, he said. How many of them asked to buy potatoes? All but one. Then their contempt has an appetite. He laughed quietly at first, then, with the astonishment of a man hearing himself after a long illness, they established a fixed price below the market, but high enough to pay wages and seed. Each parish sent a list certified by its clergyman and 2 householders. Families without money could earn food through harvest labor, road repair, or preserving work. There would be no scramble at the gates and favor purchased with a bow. You have made charity into an account, Nathaniel said. No, I have made dignity visible inside one. By August, the branches required props beneath their fruit. The old trees did not all recover. Nearly half would need removal over several winters, and Cecily marked each doomed trunk with red cloth. But the living rows carried russet apples, small green pears, and dark damsons. Beneath them, potato ridges rose like sleeping animals. Bean pods dried thick on the stems. Cabbages along the wall folded tight around pale hearts. The orchard people stopped calling the place Cinder. They called it Her Grace's Ground. Nathaniel began joining Cecily on the evening rounds. He learned every worker's name. He learned that Alice Breyer had kept a brewery's books before marriage, that Ruth Packer could mend a barrel faster than 2 Coopers, and that Jem understood water gates better than the men paid to maintain them. Each discovery exposed something his old method of governing had concealed. One evening, they found a young pear tree split beneath its weight. Cecily held the 2 halves together, while Nathaniel bound them with cloth and grafting wax. "Will it live?" he asked, "if the break is clean and we keep it supported? You make that sound like a judgment upon me. Not every damaged thing is a metaphor. How disappointing." Her smile faded when he touched the scar across her palm, left by the broken sluice strap. "I cannot undo the breakfast," he said. "No, nor the morning I left." "No, but if you permit it, I would like to become a husband, after having so thoroughly succeeded at being a duke." Cecily looked at their hands around the wounded branch. "Begin by becoming Nathaniel. I have met the Duke often enough." He bent and kissed her soil-stained fingers. Nothing more passed between them, but she felt the warmth of it during the entire walk home. Rusk made his offer 3 days later. He waited outside the parish church after Sunday service, wearing a new grey coat. Beside him stood Mr. Abel Bexley, a heavy man with a gold watch chain and the smooth hands of one who traded in other people's hunger. "Close the orchard to parish sales," Bexley said. "Deliver its entire harvest to our warehouses at the contract price, and the Michaelmas interest will be extended 1 year." "The contract price is 1/3 of market," Cecily said. "The orchard produce secures our advance. It cannot. The land is held to my separate use." Bexley produced a folded instrument. "The late Duke's general security covers all crops, rents, and produce arising from Briarwick lands." "My settlement was executed later," she said. Rusk smiled. "Then a court may decide which instrument governs. Courts take time. Potatoes rot." Nathaniel read the document. His father's mark appeared beneath wording broad enough to ruin them if a judge accepted it. One witness was dead. The other had departed England. "You stole the surveyor's letter, because it proves the orchard water and produce were excluded," Cecily said. A serious allegation from a lady unable to produce such a letter. Nathaniel folded the security and returned it to Bexley. "You will receive no apple, bean, turnip, or potato from my wife's ground. Then we shall take them." "Try." The churchyard emptied around them. Rusk lowered his voice. "You mistake affection for solvency, Your Grace. When the bailiffs arrive, Her Grace will learn that vegetables do not defeat a signature. Nor does a signature survive proof of fraud, Nathaniel said. Rusk's eyes moved between them. You have no proof. Cecily heard the thing he needed them to believe. That evening, Nathaniel left for London with copies of the pump house accounts and the name of the clerk who had witnessed his father's mark. He promised to return before Michaelmas. Promises have not served us particularly well, Cecily said beside the carriage. Then judge me by the road when it is over. He kissed her once. There was no audience, no contract, and no resentment in it. Then he was gone. The harvest began without him. For 12 days, the orchard rang from before sunrise until moonrise. Potatoes rolled from the lifted earth. Beans filled canvas sacks. Apples struck the padded bottoms of baskets with soft, steady thuds. The drying house steamed with fruit. Children twisted turnip leaves into bundles for the cattle. Cecily kept the tally in chalk across the packing shed wall. 246 tons of potatoes, 61 tons of turnips and cabbages, more beans than their oldest scale could weigh without repair, apples enough for fresh eating, drying, preserves, and cider. It would not replace the county's failed wheat. It would do something more immediate. It would carry thousands of people across the hungry space between autumn and the next spring sowing. 17 parish wagons were due at the orchard on Michaelmas morning. Nathaniel had not returned. On the night before the distribution, rain swept across Mereford on a hard western wind. Cecily slept for less than an hour in the orchard office. At dawn, she stepped outside and found wagons already lining the road, lanterns glowing beneath oilcloth covers. Men had come from villages she had never visited. Women sat beside empty baskets. Children watched the gates with the grave patience of those accustomed to waiting for food. The sight nearly broke her. She turned before anyone could see and ordered the gates opened. They moved the first wagon beneath the weighing crane. Alice called parish names. Thomas directed loading. Jem ran ration lists between the office and the gate. The rain weakened to a silver mist. Then hoofbeats approached from the eastern road. Rusk arrived with Abel Bexley, 6 hired men, 2 bailiffs, and a magistrate's temporary writ. Iron chains hung from the side of their cart. Stop the loading, one bailiff called. No one obeyed. Rusk stepped through the gate. All produce upon these lands is seized pending settlement of debt. Cecily came down from the scale platform. Her brown harvest dress was wet at the shoulders, and her wedding ring hung on a cord beneath it to keep from catching in the ropes. This ground is mine under settlement. Then you may explain that to the court after we remove the crop. The hired men began drawing the gates together. Villagers pressed forward. A child cried. The bailiff put a hand on his baton. Cecily climbed onto the stone mounting block. No one raises a hand, she called. No one gives Mr. Rusk the disorder he came here to purchase. The crowd stilled. Rusk's mouth tightened. He signaled to his men. Chains passed through the gate rings. The first parish wagon stood half-loaded inside. 16 waited beyond. All that food, all those months of labour, stopped by an iron link and a disputed piece of paper. Jem pushed through the workers and tugged Cecily's sleeve. He has it, the boy whispered. What? The letter, in his red case. I saw the grey seal when he opened it for the writ. Rusk's dispatch case rested on the seizure cart beside the north wall. Cecily caught Jem's wrist. You will go to your mother and remain there. He nodded. Then Rusk ordered the orchard office sealed, and every eye turned toward the bailiffs. Jem slipped away. Cecily saw him only when he reached the cart. The boy seized the grey-edged letter and ran between the apple rows. Stop him, Rusk shouted. 2 hired men followed. Jem darted into the packing shed, where hundreds of baskets stood beneath the repaired roof. Rusk snatched a lantern from the cart and went after them. Cecily jumped from the mounting block. "Jem!" Inside the shed, something crashed. The lantern flame appeared first as a thin orange line beneath the door. Then it climbed a wall of dry baskets. Fire took the rafters in a single breath. People screamed and scattered from the heat. Rusk stumbled out through the side door without his coat. One of his men followed, beating sparks from his sleeve. Jem did not emerge. Cecily ran toward the main door. Thomas caught her arm. "The roof will fall." The north sorting hatch opens beside the watercourse. She tore free and crossed the channel on the low bridge. Smoke rolled through the hatch in black folds. She dropped to her knees, pulled her wet apron over her mouth and crawled inside. The heat erased direction. Baskets burned in tall orange columns. Apples burst upon the floor. "Somewhere ahead," Jem coughed. "Follow my voice," she called. "I can't, my leg's caught." She found him beneath the weighing table, pinned by a fallen beam no thicker than her wrist but burning at one end. The sealed letter lay under his chest. Cecily wrapped both hands around the beam. It did not move. The roof groaned above them. Outside, a voice cut through the shouting. "Cecily!" Nathaniel had returned. She could not answer without breathing smoke. She braced one foot against the table and pulled again. The beam shifted an inch. Jem screamed. A section of burning thatch fell behind her and closed the way to the hatch. Nathaniel appeared through the smoke on the other side. His coat covered his head and shoulders. He reached them, lifted the beam with both hands, and Cecily dragged Jem free. "The door," Nathaniel said. "Blocked." Then the wall. The northern boards were old and damp from the channel. Nathaniel kicked once, twice, and opened a split between them. Hands from outside tore the boards away. Thomas pulled Jem through. Cecily thrust the sealed letter after him. The roof gave another long crack. Nathaniel pushed her toward the opening. "Go," together. They fell out as the center rafters collapsed. Rain hissed against the flames, but could not master them. Fire crossed the shed roof toward the storehouse where the potatoes and beans waited. If it reached the dry pea haulms stacked behind the wall, half the harvest would burn. Cecily rose on bleeding palms. "Open the orchard sluice," she shouted. Allies stared at the narrow channel. "It won't reach the storehouse. Break the south bank and cut a trench across the yard." Thomas understood first. He seized a mattock. Workers followed with spades, hoes, and bare hands. Nathaniel ran to the iron wheel beside the holding pond. Rusk blocked his path. "That water belongs to the estate." Nathaniel struck him once. Rusk fell into the mud. The Duke turned the wheel. Water that had been stolen for years surged through the opened gate. It filled Cecily's trench, curved around the burning shed, and spread into the yard beneath the storehouse wall. Men threw it in buckets. Women soaked blankets and laid them across the pea stacks. Steam covered the building in a white cloud. The fire reached the trench and stopped for several seconds. Only rain, water, and the collapse of blackened timber could be heard. Then Jem lifted the letter above his head. The grey seal was scorched, but unbroken. Nathaniel's solicitor stepped through the chained gate with the Merriford magistrate and 2 constables behind him. They had ridden through the night from London. In the solicitor's case lay a statement from the surviving clerk who had witnessed the old Duke's mark. The signature on Bexley's general security had been placed on a blank sheet intended for repairs to the Eastern Bridge. The broad debt instrument had been written above it later, forgery. Nathaniel broke the seal on Edwin Shaw's letter before the magistrate. The dead surveyor had recorded Rusk's diversion of the spring, the falsified orchard yields, and his secret interest in Bexley's grain contracts. He had also enclosed a copy of the original water covenant, which reserved the orchard and village shares beyond any estate security. Rusk climbed from the mud. A dead man's accusations proved nothing. Your pump-house receipts prove the grain fraud, Cecily said. Your key proves the theft. Your forged instrument proves the seizure. And 17 parishes just watched you chase a child into a fire to recover the letter that joins them all. The former steward looked toward his hired men. They had moved away from him. The constables took his arms. Rusker's composure finally broke. You stupid woman. Do you know what this food has cost me? Cecily looked past him to the wagons, the wet sacks, and the villagers waiting beyond the chained gate. Everything, she said. That is why you feared it. Nathaniel took the iron chain in both hands. One of the orchard men brought a sledge. Together they shattered the lock. The gate opened. Rusk twisted toward the Duke. You gave her this place because it was worthless. Nathaniel's face bore soot, rain, and the first honest shame Rusk had ever seen upon it. Yes, he said, and that is the disgrace I shall spend the rest of my life repairing. He turned to Alice at the tally table. Load every wagon. Nothing leaves for Bexley. Everything beyond this gate answers to her grace. The first cart rolled forward. By sunset, food from the orchard had entered every parish in Merriford. Gideon Rusk and Abel Bexley were held for the county assizes. The forged security failed before it could reach a full hearing. Faced with copied accounts, witness statements, and the surviving clerk's testimony, Bexley's firm surrendered its claim and entered bankruptcy before Christmas. Rusk was convicted of fraud, theft, and setting the packing shed alight. He never returned to Briarwick. Nathaniel sold the London house and 6 racehorses to settle the lawful part of the estate debt. He sold no tenant farms. Lady Lavinia objected to losing the town ballroom until Mrs. Pell observed that no one had danced in it for 8 years. After that, even Lady Lavinia found silence economical. The orchard workers rebuilt the packing shed in stone. Alice Briar became its salaried clerk. Ruth Packer supervised preserving and cooperage. Thomas accepted the title of head gardener on the condition that no duke would instruct him in pruning. Jem received a new pair of boots, 3 hot meals each day, and lessons from the estate schoolmaster. The scorched edge of the surveyor's letter was preserved beneath glass in Cecily's office, not as an ornament, but as evidence that useful truths should never depend upon one locked drawer. The autumn figures were printed and posted at every parish church. The orchard had not fed Merriford through apples alone. It had fed the county through potatoes planted between old roots, beans dried for winter, turnips lifted after the first crop, wages placed in hands that had been empty, and prices kept low when scarcity might have made fortunes. No one called it charity. They called it the Michaelmas harvest. Nathaniel asked Cecily to walk with him on the final evening of October. Frost silvered the grass. The living trees had shed most of their leaves, and the orchard smelled of damp bark, wood smoke, and stored apples. They stopped beside the first tree she had cut at the bark. The narrow mark had healed into a pale seam. I made vows to you once, Nathaniel said. I spoke them as terms in a surrender. Cecily slipped her hand into his. I remember. May I make them again when I have earned the right to be believed? You may spend your life earning it. He looked down, accepting the judgment. Then she added, as shall I. Nathaniel raised her hand to his mouth. Is that forgiveness? It is employment. He laughed against her fingers. Their second wedding took place the following spring beneath the orchard blossom. There were no solicitors at the table, no blackened twig, and no guests invited merely because rank required them. The workers stood nearest. Jem carried the rings. Mrs. Pell cried without apology. Nathaniel gave Cecily no land that day. He placed the estate keys in her hand and asked her to govern Briarwick with him. She accepted only after adding his name beneath hers in the orchard wage book. Years later, travellers are still asked to see the dead orchard that had fed a county. They expected a monument. What they found was work. Young trees grafted to old rootstock, bees waking in the eastern bowls, children, learning figures in the rebuilt shed, and carts passing freely through gates that were never chained again. On cold mornings, Cecily sometimes kept the black apple twig from her wedding beside the account book. Not to remember the insult, to remember what had been mistaken for an ending. Thank you for staying with Cecily's story to the very end. A story about dignity, patient courage, and a woman who turned a cruel wedding gift into life for an entire county. If her journey moved you, please like this video. It helps the algorithm carry more historical drama to viewers who love these stories. Share it with a fellow historical romance lover and subscribe to Secrets of Belgrave with notifications turned on for the next full story. Before you go, tell us in the comments, at what moment do you believe Nathaniel truly became worthy of Cecily? The opened sluice, the burning orchard, or the second wedding beneath the blossom?